Deleted Peppa Pig episode, The Living Toy. George loved his dinosaur, but that day, the toy fell into a place where it shouldn't have gone. George didn't know some toys find their owners on their own. When George disappeared, Peppa decided to look for him, but she had no idea. She would have to search not for her brother, but for what had taken him. The trail led to the nursery, where it all began. The door to the nursery swung open, and Peppa saw a giant dinosaur holding George in its claws.
Give him back!
Peppa shouted, but the dinosaur already knew his name. Peppa tried to rescue her brother, but the dinosaur swatted her away with its tail. George mumbled. His voice sounded strange, as if the dinosaur was learning how to be him. Peppa grabbed a toy hammer and struck the dinosaur's paw. It dropped George.
Run!
Peppa yelled, but George didn't move. His eyes turned red. In the morning, George returned, but Peppa saw that now the dinosaur was always watching him. At night, a voice was heard behind the door.
The little dinosaur. Mine.
He waiting, because children can be lost so easily, especially when they think they've been found. Deleted Peppa Pig episode, The Secret Room. It was an ordinary day. Peppa was playing with her toys. Suddenly, she noticed a small crack in the wall behind the bookcase. When Peppa approached the wall, the crack began to widen, as if something inside was moving. Carefully, she reached out and pressed a hidden panel. The wall slowly slid aside, revealing a small, dark room, a forgotten corner of the house. Peppa stepped inside. Inside, it was dark and silent. Old photographs of her family hung on the walls, but their faces were distorted and their eyes stared directly at her. In the center of the room stood an old chest with a lock. Peppa tried to open it, but it was locked. Suddenly, a faint rustling sound came from the darkness. She turned around, but there was no one there. She noticed her reflection in a mirror on the wall. Her own face was twisted into a terrible grimace, and her eyes shone with bright red light. At that moment, the room began to shake and fade away. A creepy voice echoed.
You shouldn't have come in here.
Peppa tried to escape, but the door had already slammed shut. When she woke up at home in the morning, everything seemed normal. But when she looked in the bathroom mirror, her reflection smiled wider than usual, and her eyes were black as night. Suddenly, a sinister voice came from the mirror.
This is only the beginning.
This is a lost episode that was never aired on TV. It all began on a normal day. Peppa lost one of her baby teeth. "Hooray!" she shouted, "Dad. Now the tooth fairy will bring me a gift." Mummy Pig smiled. "Put the tooth under your pillow, dear. There'll be a surprise in the morning." That night, Peppa woke up. The room was dark, but something felt wrong. She heard a crunching sound from under her pillow. When she lifted it, the tooth was gone, but there was no gift either. Only a strange white lump, like it was made of bones. The next day, George complained about a toothache. Then Mummy Pig, then Daddy Pig. They all said, maybe we ate something bad. That night, Peppa woke up again, but not from the crunch. This time, from breathing. Someone was sitting by her bed, a figure, gray, far too tall, with long arms and a grin that stretched ear to ear. "Do you brush your teeth well, Peppa?" it whispered. "You give them to me, one by one, every night." Peppa screamed, but no one came. George was asleep with his mouth open. His front teeth were missing. Mummy was standing in the hallway, smiling. On her cheek, a white patch like bone powder. Peppa ran to the mirror. On her face, new teeth were growing, but not hers. A third row. She ran back to the bedroom. Everyone's teeth were falling out, more and more every second, and someone stood in the corner. That same figure, but its face Oh God. The tape. Peppa found a box in the closet. Dusty. Old. On it was written, "Our home," in childish handwriting. Inside was a tape, a regular VHS, but their family hadn't owned a player in years. Mummy Pig was surprised. Someone must have mixed it up. Let's throw it away? But Daddy Pig said, "I have an old player in the basement. We can watch." That evening, they all gathered in the living room. The screen flickered. The image shook. On the tape, their house, like someone was standing silently, filming. "Strange," said Mummy Pig. "I don't remember anyone recording us." Then, dinner scene. Everyone sitting at the table. Daddy, Mummy, and Peppa on both sides. Two Peppas, identical, both eating. But one of them smiled. Wrong. Suddenly, one of them turned her head and looked directly into the camera. And in the next instant, she was standing in their room. The deleted episode of Peppa Pig. The porcelain doll. Peppa finds an old, dusty toy box in the attic. Inside is a large doll with a porcelain face, but it doesn't have a face, just a smooth white oval. "What a strange doll," says Peppa, looking at her. George looks at the doll with apprehension and hides behind his mother. At night, it seems to Peppa that the doll is looking at her. She hears quiet whispers from her room, even though no one is there. The next morning, the doll is in a different place. Peppa tries to get rid of the doll, but it always comes back. One day, while playing with George, Peppa draws the doll's face with a marker pen. At first, it's funny, but at night, the face on the doll changes. Now it's an evil grimace with sharp teeth and glowing red eyes. Peppa is terrified. She realizes that the doll is alive and something bad is happening. She runs to Mama Piggy, but she doesn't believe her. At night, Peppa wakes up from the cold. She sees a doll by her bed. The doll stretches its porcelain hand towards her. Peppa screams, but no one comes. In the morning, Peppa disappears. George is playing alone in the garden, but he is no longer grunting with joy. He holds a faceless doll in his hands. Piggy's mom and dad are standing at the window, their faces full of despair. Their voices are barely audible. "Where is our Peppa?" Deleted episode of Peppa Pig, the ominous song. This episode was never aired on TV. It all started when Peppa and George found an old music box in a chest in the attic. George accidentally wound it up, and a strange, unnatural melody began to play. The music was eerie, almost as if it shouldn't be heard at that moment. The music grew louder, and the air in the room turned cold and heavy. Suddenly, the walls began to ripple as though they were breathing. Shadows on the walls began to come alive, stretching into odd, twisted shapes that moved around the room. Peppa and George noticed their reflections in the mirror had become distorted. Their eyes were enormous, and their smiles twisted into something unnatural, like they weren't their own. "I can't take this anymore," whispered Peppa, grabbing George's hand. But when they tried to leave, the door was locked. The music grew louder, and the room began to fill with darkness. At that moment, Papa Pig rushed into the room, his face twisted in a strange smile. He saw the music box and said with surprise, "This is my old music box. I thought I lost it years ago." But his voice was different, deep and unnatural. "Papa, what's happening to you?" asked Peppa in fear. As soon as Papa Pig touched the box, his body began to distort. His face twisted, his eyes darkened, and his arms elongated unnaturally. "Now I can play again," he whispered, and his laugh, low and metallic, filled the room. Peppa and George watched in horror as Papa Pig lost all human form, his body collapsing into a shadow that couldn't stop moving. "I can't stop it," he said, and his figure faded into the darkness, swallowed by emptiness. The box started playing again. The music became unbearably loud, echoing through the room as if the room itself was alive. The walls cracked, and the shadows grew more menacing. Suddenly, Peppa and George felt something pulling them inside. They couldn't move, couldn't resist. "What's happening?" screamed George, but his voice was drowned by the music. At that moment, everything around them turned dark, and the room disappeared. Instead, they found themselves in an endless void, an abyss, where there was nothing but the sound of the music. Inside the box, everything was closed off, consuming them into its vast depths. Peppa and George stood in this nightmarish void, surrounded by dark shadows that wouldn't let them go. Their bodies grew heavier, and the music became more unbearable, as if it were a part of this endless darkness. "Are we stuck here forever?" whispered Peppa. And just as they tried to speak their last words, everything around them dissolved into the darkness, and the sound of the box merged with the silence. The music stopped, and the episode ended. Never-ending day. It all started like any other day. Peppa woke up in her bed. The sun was shining. Mummy Pig called her to breakfast. George was eating cereal. Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. Everything felt calm. But the newspaper was blank, just empty white pages. Peppa blinked. She thought it was nothing. She went outside. Everything was the same phrases, the same smiles. The next day, everything repeated. Same breakfast, same weather. Mummy Pig started repeating the same words. "Breakfast is getting cold. Breakfast is getting cold. Breakfast is getting cold." Daddy sat frozen with a strange smile. George stared directly at the screen, unblinking. Peppa felt time breaking. She opened her eyes one day and saw strangers in her room. They had her face, all of them, and they just stared. She walked to the mirror. Her reflection didn't move. Its eyes were dark, unnatural. Once she saw George writing on the wall with black chalk. Peppa didn't escape, and then the writing vanished. One morning, Mummy Pig stood still, facing the wall. Peppa screamed her name, but Mummy didn't respond. Then slowly, she turned around, and her face wasn't hers. Another day, Peppa opened the front door, but there was no street, just a black wall. Dark shapes began appearing in the corners of the room. They didn't move, but Peppa knew they were watching her. And then, she didn't wake up in her bed. She woke up inside a cardboard box. There was a price tag on her chest, $13.99. Voices outside whispered, "Let's take this one. Give it to the kid." For the last time, Peppa opened her eyes and saw a screen. On the screen, just one line of text, "File successfully deleted." And then there was only black. No Peppa, no day, just silence. Grandpa's letter. One day, our grandfather left and never came back. We searched for him, but it was no use. Half a year later, while going through his closet, I picked up Grandpa's coat and felt something in the pocket. I reached in, unfolded a note, and saw his handwriting. It said, "My dear ones, this is not a farewell, not a will. It's a joke. I've been living in the forest with an old friend you've never met. Here's the address. Once you find this letter, come visit. I want to see your faces." A week later, we drove to the coordinates. The forest was deep, the road broken, no signal. The house was real, Wooden, old. Inside, it smelled like firewood. We waited an hour, then 2. Night fell quickly. Something rustled outside. Dad went to check. He didn't come back. We were alone. George noticed one of the cups was empty. Peppa turned around, but she wasn't looking at Mom anymore. She was staring at something behind her. Juice. Peppa came home and said, "Look what I bought." She was holding a bottle. Everyone sat at the table. Peppa poured juice for George, then for herself, then for their parents. Just a few minutes later, George turned gray. His skin looked dusty, like he hadn't breathed in days. "Mom, something's wrong with George," Peppa saw or screamed, but Mummy Pig simply turned her head, and with a wide, terrifying smile, she said, "It's okay, darling. Just rest." Her eyes were strange. Peppa ran to her room in horror, slammed the door, and hid under the blanket. She tried to sleep, but couldn't. She opened her eyes and realized something was wrong with her body. Her skin was pulsing. Eyes were growing. On her neck, her arms, her stomach. She ran to the mirror. Her reflection was distorted. It moved before she did. A mutant with dozens of eyes. Peppa panicked and ran to the door, locked the window. But outside, only a brick wall. She screamed, and she woke up. She was outside, but it wasn't her world anymore. It was cold and terrifying. George started drawing strange pictures. In each one, a creature with a round head and white eyes, no arms, no legs, just a body. "It comes at night," George whispered. "I saw it." Peppa didn't believe him, but that night she woke up, and in the corner of her room, something was lying there, a huge round head. It didn't move, but it was breathing. When she turned on the light, it vanished. The next night, her flashlight went out. She heard something crawling under the bed, no footsteps, just a sticky sliding sound. Peppa looked down, and it was there. Face inches away, head round, eyes white. In the morning, George's eyes had turned completely gray. He didn't speak. He just stared at Peppa, and then it came again. From the wall, across the ceiling. It stopped right above her, and then the words,
"Now you've seen me too."
1313. This episode was never watched till the end. Peppa was sitting in the living room watching cartoons. A black frame flashed on the screen. Just for a second. There was a clock. It showed 1313. Peppa blinked. She walked to the kitchen. Mummy Pig stood by the stove. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," she said. Peppa walked up to George. He was drawing, but he didn't blink. George? No reaction. Peppa looked at the wall clock, 1313. But every clock in the house showed 1330. Everything was frozen. Peppa looked in the mirror, and there her reflection blinked before she did, and smiled. A strange, unnatural smile.
Peppa!
Daddy stepped closer, but his face wasn't his face. It looked drawn like a mask. He kept repeating one sentence.
It's almost 1313, 1313.
The candy. When Peppa became a teenager, everything started to change. Friends drifted away. Her parents became annoying. And one day, while standing alone behind the school, a man in a blue cloak approached her and held out a box. "Try it. These aren't just candies. They feel like being loved." At first, Peppa didn't believe him, but the candies really did something. After the first, she laughed until she cried. After the second, she felt loved. And after the third, the world became soft and warm, like childhood. She started selling them to classmates. Everyone wanted them. Everyone paid, even the teachers. Her mother asked, "Where did you get this money?" Peppa just shrugged, and Daddy Pig said, "You know sweets are bad for you." A week later, George disappeared. He never came home. Peppa found one of the candies in his room, but it had turned pitch black. Later, she learned, each box can only be opened once. If you open it again, you must give something in return. Peppa opened it a second time, but there were no candies. Inside was George's head with crosses over his eyes. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door.
Open up, police!
The face in the corner. This deleted episode was never aired on television. Something caught Peppa's attention. She stopped and looked toward the corner. In the corner of the room, near the ceiling, a blurry face appeared. It was barely visible, like a shadow, but its expression was cold, lifeless. It stared at Peppa, as if studying her every move. Peppa froze, unable to look away. The shadows on the walls began to shift and twist, as if they were alive. Her heart started beating faster. Something was wrong. Something was there that shouldn't have been. She stepped forward, trying to understand what was happening, but the face didn't vanish. It became clearer. Now it was right in the top corner of the room. Peppa felt the air grow colder. Darkness began pulling her toward that corner. At that moment, Daddy Pig entered the room. He looked at Peppa and George with surprise, but his voice sounded strange, low and distorted.
What are you two doing here?
Daddy Pig walked toward the corner where the face had just been, but now it was gone. Instead, the shadows became more sinister, and the air around them thickened. He touched the corner, and something horrifying began. His face started to change. His eyes darkened. His arms grew long and misshapen. His voice turned into a deep echo from the dark corner.
Now I can play again.
Peppa and George tried to back away, but the shadows had already filled the room, and the walls began to ripple. A strange, unnatural music filled the air, making everything around them feel alive. They tried to escape, but the door was locked. The room began fading into darkness, and the music grew louder, swallowing them whole. We can't get out, Peppa whispered, her voice consumed by the shadows. Darkness swallowed everything. The shadows on the walls grew unimaginably large, and the sound of the music became unbearable. Peppa and George stood in a void, surrounded by the shadow. In that dark nothingness, they realized they couldn't leave. Everything around them was part of the emptiness. The music never stopped. Are we here forever? Daddy Pig, Peppa, and George decided to go for a walk by the pond. When they reached the bend, the path to the pond was blocked. A sign read, "Passage closed." But nearby, there was another sign pointing toward the forest. Daddy Pig noticed a fallen signpost. He picked it up and said,
Probably this way.
A narrow trail led into a sparse forest. The further they went, the quieter everything around became. No wind, no birds, only footsteps. Suddenly, a duck appeared. Daddy Pig suggested following her as she might lead them to the pond. Peppa was wary of the duck's behavior. She seemed strange. The duck started moving chaotically, but no one except Peppa paid attention to it. It seemed like they were walking in circles. Same sign, same turn, but not the same place. George looked into a puddle and saw himself, but his reflection was going backwards. Finally, the pond, but it didn't ring with duck calls or splash like usual. It was waiting. The water was smooth, dark, unnaturally black. At first, one duck appeared, then two. Their eyes were red. When Peppa looked at her reflection, it disappeared. Only an empty surface remained. Peppa stepped closer to see better, but the reflection no longer waited. It pulled her inside. She was falling, but not downwards, through images like through cracks in glass. Something was waiting for her below. Suddenly, all became normal again, but she didn't say a word. They returned home. Everything looked normal. Almost. Peppa was standing at the window. She looked like Peppa, but only on the outside. A bright, sunny day, the entire Peppa family was on their way to visit Grandma and Grandpa,
I can't wait to see Grandma and Grandpa.
said Peppa.
Dinosaur. Grrr.
exclaimed George. They enjoyed a cozy time together, baking cookies. Peppa and George exchanged mischievous smiles,
Let's explore the basement.
suggested Peppa. They tiptoed down the creaky stairs into the dimly lit basement. In the corner stood a dusty chest covered in cobwebs.
What is that? A treasure chest?
Peppa asked in surprise. She opened it with a loud creak. Suddenly, dark shadows burst out from inside, forming sinister figures. "Peppa, I'm scared," George said fearfully. At that moment, everything in the kitchen was peaceful and calm. The family was drinking tea when, suddenly, the children's screams prompted the parents to go downstairs.
What's going on, kids?
Asked Mummy Pig. The shadows swirled around the parents, trying to pull them into the chest. Daddy Pig grabbed one of the tentacles that was emerging from the chest.
George, Peppa, back away.
Daddy Pig shouted sternly. But suddenly, one of the shadows struck him, causing him to lose his balance and loosen his grip. The shadows swallowed the parents. Grandma and Grandpa were having a lovely chat in the kitchen, but Grandpa noticed that no one had come back from the basement for a long time and decided to check. Grandpa Pig hurried down the stairs with a serious look on his face.
Inside this chest were the souls of those brave enough to open it. I found this on an old ship.
He said grimly.
It's a curse.
He pulled out an old book from his pocket and began to recite a spell. The shadows taunted Grandpa, whispering incomprehensible words, and he looked frightened.
Grandpa, help us!
Peppa cried out. The shadows started to dissolve, but suddenly George snatched the book from Grandpa's hands and threw it onto the floor. His eyes turned red as if he were under hypnosis. "No more light needed," he declared. The remaining shadows lunged at Grandpa, dragging him into the chest. He struggled but was helpless. Peppa watched in horror as George advanced toward her with tears in her eyes.
What are you doing?
She shouted in fear. With tears streaming down her face, she grabbed the tattered book tightly and held it high.
I won't let you take my family!
She declared to the shadows, her voice trembling but resolute. She recited something she remembered from Grandpa's stories. The shadows screamed and began to vanish. Silence fell over the basement. Peppa and George were left alone, trembling with horror as they realized they had lost their family. At that moment, Grandma was enjoying the taste of her tea and listening to pleasant music, but a feeling of unease disturbed her peace. Grandma Pig appeared at the top of the stairs, looking horrified at what was happening. Peppa and George looked at each other, trembling, speechless. From inside the open chest, faint whispers of the shadows still echoed softly. It was an ordinary day. Peppa's math teacher, Madame Gazelle, started coming to her house. At first, Peppa enjoyed studying with her. However, after a few days, Peppa became thin and sad. Her parents started to worry.
Peppa, you must eat.
Mama Pig insisted, but Peppa didn't want anything except math.
Please, call Madame Gazelle!
Her parents obeyed their daughter's request. Peppa looked worse and worse. Madame Gazelle sat with her in the room and taught her mathematics. Suddenly, she pulled out a pink stone. Peppa's pupils disappeared, and she floated up as if hypnotized.
Math is your life, Peppa,
said Madame Gazelle with a sinister smile. Meanwhile, her parents had no idea what was happening. They were sitting in the living room watching TV.
What an interesting movie,
said Daddy Pig. A few days later, Peppa could no longer walk or talk.
Why isn't she getting better?
Mama Pig asked, wiping tears from her eyes. One day, Mama Pig saw Madame Gazelle smiling menacingly, holding a stone over Peppa.
What is going on here?
Shouted Mama Pig.
Get out of here, Madame Gazelle,
said Daddy Pig, looking at her with suspicion. The room darkened. Madame Gazelle transformed into a terrible monster that only said one thing.
Math will take over the world. Bow to it.
A cold wind blew. Everything around turned into a tornado of notebooks and numbers. In the morning, everyone sat at the table with crazy faces. They were solving problems while Madame Gazelle loomed over them as if controlling their minds. Peppa found a box in the closet. Dusty, old. On it was written, "Our home," in childish handwriting. Inside was a tape, a regular VHS, but their family hadn't owned a player in years. Mummy Pig was surprised. Someone must have mixed it up. Let's throw it away? But Daddy Pig said, "I have an old player in the basement. We can watch." That evening, they all gathered in the living room. The screen flickered. The image shook. On the tape, their house, like someone was standing silently, filming. "Strange," said Mummy Pig. "I don't remember anyone recording us." Then, dinner scene. Everyone sitting at the table. Daddy, Mummy, and Peppa on both sides. Two Peppas, identical, both eating. But one of them smiled. Wrong. Suddenly, one of them turned her head and looked directly into the camera. And in the next instant, she was standing in their room. George started drawing strange pictures. In each one, a creature with a round head and white eyes, no arms, no legs, just a body. "It comes at night," George whispered. "I saw it." Peppa didn't believe him, but that night she woke up, and in the corner of her room, something was lying there, a huge round head. It didn't move, but it was breathing. When she turned on the light, it vanished. The next night, her flashlight went out. She heard something crawling under the bed, no footsteps, just a sticky sliding sound. Peppa looked down, and it was there. Face inches away, head round, eyes white. In the morning, George's eyes had turned completely gray. He didn't speak. He just stared at Peppa, and then it came again. From the wall, across the ceiling. It stopped right above her, and then the words,
Now you've seen me too.
Peppa and George were playing hide and seek, just like always. George chose a cozy spot, a little further than usual. Peppa was walking through an empty hall. The house seemed frozen in time. George was hiding well, too well. Mommy Pig was washing the dishes, but her movements were a bit slowed down.
Mommy, George isn't coming out.
He always plays like that.
Peppa felt the presence of something supernatural. The wardrobe where George was hiding was now closer than before. George was always nearby, but he wasn't here. The game of hide and seek had long since crossed into another realm. Peppa approached the window. There was George. He was outside, looking at Peppa and trying to get her attention. Turning around, Peppa noticed that George was also inside. She went outside. The yard was empty. The grass was pressed down, as if someone had just left. But now, in the window, there was her, the one who hadn't come out. Peppa decided to go back home. The door creaked as if someone was pulling it at the same time she did. Something in the house had changed, like it was shrinking. The wardrobe remained, but it no longer hid anything. Peppa entered the kitchen. George sat with his back to her at the table. He was waiting, but something was wrong. His face was blurred. He whispered, "You lose. The game was over." But had it ever really begun? Deleted Peppa Pig episode, The Living Toy. George loved his dinosaur, but that day, the toy fell into a place where it shouldn't have gone. George didn't know. Some toys find their owners on their own. When George disappeared, Peppa decided to look for him, but she had no idea. She would have to search not for her brother, but for what had taken him. The trail led to the nursery, where it all began. The door to the nursery swung open, and Peppa saw a giant dinosaur holding George in its claws.
Give him back!
Peppa shouted, but the dinosaur already knew his name. Peppa tried to rescue her brother, but the dinosaur swatted her away with its tail. George mumbled. His voice sounded strange, as if the dinosaur was learning how to be him. Peppa grabbed a toy hammer and struck the dinosaur's paw. It dropped George.
Run!
Peppa yelled, but George didn't move. His eyes turned red. In the morning, George returned, but Peppa saw that now the dinosaur was always watching him. At night, a voice was heard behind the door.
The little dinosaur. Mine.
He waiting, because children can be lost so easily, especially when they think they've been found.